Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater, and we're so fortunate today to be joined by the fantastic Brendan Scannell, who's currently starring in the Netflix series Bonding. And one of the first things I was really interested in was the fact that when you were shooting the first season, you and Zoe Levin only got the opportunity to meet right before you went into shooting your first scene together. So you really didn't have much of an opportunity to talk about character or to rehearse any of the scenes. And so coming back into season two and having a little bit more advance on knowing that you were going back into this together, what did you want to spend that time on with each other as kind of a rediscovery with your characters and figuring out the deeper layers that you wanted to explore together?
Yeah, that is an interesting part of season one. It was all came together really quickly and was such a small production. And I was shooting in LA, and I wrapped on a Thursday, and I flew on a Friday on a red eye, got to New York, did my fitting, and then I went to set on that Friday. And then I met her, and then we shot a scene in the first season that is basically like our breakup scene as a friend. The show is so much about two the complicated dynamics between a friendship and the power dynamics in something like that, and the history of it. And we shot basically one of our most dramatic scenes having just met each other 45 minutes before. um, and so an interesting part of that is that it seemed like it turned out okay. So sometimes as an actor, your job is to just be present and trust that all the other parts of the story are being told. And so for season two, what was nice we is that Zoe and I have been friends now for over 3 years. She has stayed in my house. We've traveled together, and so just trying to bring that some of that depth that we have in our personal life to and comfortability to the second season, without thinking about it too much, was definitely like a huge gift. Plus, I think we were both just so grateful to be able to be playing these characters again after so long, that it was there was like a real sense of play when we were able to do scenes together.
Yeah. And the second season, such a beautiful exploration of a lot of the emotion within this friendship, even when it's exploring the things that aren't working for them anymore as friends at this point. And, there's a really poignant part where he's telling her that, she's always made him feel more dangerous. And, we've seen that through him coming to work with her in the Dom world. But at the same time, that he's always cared so much about what she thinks. And I was interested in how you take a lot of those kind of really poignant but small details within the script, such as how much he cares about her opinion in every single moment, and really then just carry that through in your performance throughout so many of the other scenes.
Well, I feel like for me, my way into Pete is through his his hopes and dreams, which are some career based, wanting to be a comedian, and some personal based, wanting to be in a loving relationship. Um, and and Tiff and um, this Dom community, and sort of piggyback taking parts of the Dom community into his stand up is a way that he is receiving a lot of validation in his career. He's sort of like telling stories that aren't his to tell, and co-opting this Dom world in to create a comedy act, and getting a lot of validation, getting a lot of praise, and feeling the high of that. Um, and so his relationship with Tiff becomes complicated because she has for so long been a source of validation for him through friendship and through financially through their jobs. And so as his validations and becomes more focused on other things, he starts to need Tiff's friendship less. And that's something, I experienced in my own life, where you can meet somebody and they can be such an important part of your life, and then at a certain point maybe it's time to let that go so that you can continue to grow.
Yeah.
Did I answer the question?
You absolutely did, in a really beautiful way. And I wanted to also kind of piggyback off of that and talk about his voice as a comedian, because the first season, he really just had that huge fear and apprehension about performing. And then this season, he's kind of exploring what he wants his voice to be, but also is very much manifesting it through a character that he's creating, and even questions at a certain point whether he himself would be good enough without that character as a stand-up comedian, because he's still not sure, because he's never tried it. And so I was interested in hearing a little bit about your work with Writer Doyle and just figuring out what his comedic voice was going to be, and what his styling, what his rhythm, what the beats of the comedy that he's delivering were going to be, so that you could pull that through into your performance.
Yeah, I'm a stand-up comic, and I've been doing it, 7 years basically. I moved to LA and basically was unemployed and really sad after a breakup, and I started doing stand-up, and just kind of cutting myself open every night, to please people or please myself or to feel something. And that's, I think, how a lot of people find stand up, is there's some self-mutilation involved, that you can turn your pain into comedy and into a career. And so that background sort of allows me to bring a level of experience to Pete's stand-up that writer who hasn't necessarily done it has been really gracious in like allowing me to riff, allowing me to improvise, to punch up jokes, and to sort of be a little bit of like the stand-up consultant on the show. And then when we were able to shoot all the stand-up in season 2, we had a location for 2 days basically, and on the Upper West Side in New York, this little tiny theater. And my process is always just to come in really, to basically just know my lines really well and exactly, so that then when I'm up there I don't have to be thinking about them. And that's sort of my same process for stand up, is like to know my bits so that then I can discover things on stage. So writer basically just put the camera on me, and I would go for like 5 to 10 minutes. And that was a real gift, and trust that I have in him that it would turn out. And watching the second season, one of the things as a comic, when sometimes when you're watching stand up in television, Marvelous Miss Maisel and that sort of thing, you're like, this stand up isn't actually very funny, because it's not, because there's the authenticity of watching a true thing is what makes stand up funny for me, right? And so as a audience, you're watching it and you're going, okay, this is Midge, she's a character, she's going through something, they've written stand up for her, it seems to be going well based on the audience reaction to it. But she's obviously done so much homework and can nail exactly, perform exactly how it means to be a comic on stage. So I feel like for me, the second season watching it, I'm like, oh, I think the stand-up, I buy that Pete is getting attention for this stand-up. If that makes sense, it read to me as a comic, which I'm usually my own worst critic. Like I watched the stand-up in the first season and I'm like, I wish this was better, but maybe it makes sense that it's bad because he's just starting out.
Yeah. And one of the stand-up scenes that I thought was really phenomenally crafted was, there's that one moment where he's on stage and he's performing, but he's in the midst of emotionally processing the idea of what it would have been like for him to be a father, and who he could have been as a parent in his life if he had had that opportunity. And I thought that your performance had a really beautiful duality to it, in that, he almost goes harder with the comedy and the way that he wants to shock the audience, at the same time as kind of like between your eyes, we just see what he's kind of trying to figure out and where he is in his own headspace outside of his character on stage. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about how you figured out the nuance and the duality of the performance in that moment.
I think I approached it. So in terms of the stand-up in television, it obviously it's more important that it's moving the story along, right? Because unless it's something like Seinfeld, where it's just like a bit, not just, but where it is a bit at the beginning. I won't use the word just to describe Seinfeld, because it's brilliant. But for this moment, it's basically the height of his arc in the season. And I think it's fitting that he's processing while he is also doing the thing that he loves doing the most. And that can sometimes be confusing when you're doing stand-up, because something that is painful and feels the most truthful can get you the most response, because I think that's what audiences are craving, is that sort of authenticity, that people saying things that they aren't necessarily saying in other mediums, the close proximity of it, the spontaneity of it. And so as a comic, sometimes you can lose track of whether you're processing or whether you're telling a joke or whether you are hurting yourself for the sake of the chase for laughter. So I felt like that as I was reading it for the first time, it felt very true to me, because in my life, whenever something's going wrong or going bad, the first thing I want to do about it is talk about it in front of strangers, which is a sickness, but is my life.
And then on a different note, I wanted to talk a little bit about Pete's relationship with Josh in this season, because, they've been together for a period of time and they're at the point of like really kind of going a little bit deeper with each other. And I thought it was really beautiful that, we discover that Josh isn't out to a lot of people in his life. He hasn't told his parents, he hasn't told a lot of his friends, and that Pete never tries to make him do it. And even right before Josh is considering going in to tell his dad, that Pete says to him, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. And it's kind of like, you don't have to do this for me. You need to do this when you're ready. And I was curious about what that really told you about his emotional intellect, but also his own journey with coming out and just understanding the sensitivity with which he needs to kind of pass along to Josh in that moment.
Yeah, I feel like one thing that this season does, that writer was trying to accomplish, and I think does beautifully, is he's basically taking every character and trying to flip them on their head. So you watch as Tiff, who is very closed off and dominant in the first season, you watch her begin to soften or begin to open up and become more vulnerable. And Pete, who is so submissive, becomes harder and becomes more in control of his own choices. And so in his relationship with Josh, you watch this character, Josh, who comes in the first season, is very suave and self-assured in his own sexuality, and is sort of drawing Pete into, what it means to be an adult gay man. You watch him, that sort of rug get pulled out from under him, and Theo Stockman, I think, is just such a great scene partner and such a great actor, and did a really wonderful job of going from the dominant member of our relationship to becoming the one who comes to Pete and is like, I want to do this for you. So I thought that was a great piece of writing, and I thought he played it really well.
He did. Yeah. And to piggyback off of that point of kind of Pete finding more confidence in himself and taking a little bit more control and autonomy over himself, kind of when you were looking at the scripts of the season and thinking about the different arcs of your performance, how did you kind of map out the roadmap of like emotionally where he was going to be throughout the season, in terms of just thinking about, okay, well, now he's had this experience, so this is going to give him this sense of control and this is going to give him autonomy here, and the way that you wanted to kind of really gradually build it up towards that ending?
So we shoot based on locations. We shoot it like a movie, basically, and so it is important. I really try. I'm like very much like I have a binder. I'm like that person as I show up to set, and I map out exactly where I am in the scenes, and what I'm trying to do in them, or what Pete's trying to do in them. But as I've grown, as I've become more experienced as an actor, what I've learned is that, like, it's not up to me to do all the work, like, when an actor's doing so much work, they're often overacting and trying to save, in their mind, maybe save a movie or TV show that is tanking or that has bad writing. And so what was really lovely about this second season for me is I loved the writing of it. And so I was able to just sort of let the story do the work. And my goal in the process was to just trust that every single other element of the production was doing their job, and I only had to do mine. And so that's that that is sort of where I was trying to come at it, is trusting that it was there, if that makes sense.
It
Because
absolutely does.
in the past, I watch performances I've done and I'm like, Brendan, you're doing way too much here. And so this was an exercise for me in trying to, especially a second season where with so much of the same cast and crew was coming back, like, this is a really good situation for you to just get on the track and ride the experience.
Was that the same kind of thought that you had, and approach for the relationship between Pete and Tiff? Because, we're seeing a lot more fractures in their friendship, in their relationship, and it kind of culminates a little bit towards the end. But you have to be building up to that the whole time. You can't just suddenly turn around and have them have an argument with each other. It has to be justified, and we have to kind of have seen those moments in their relationship leading up to it to kind of understand where they're both at emotionally by the time it breaks a little bit.
Right. Well, I feel like, so in a breakup, usually there's one person who has been thinking for months that it's going to come to a head, and there's typically the other person who is oblivious to that and maybe recognizes that there are problems, but problems are part of their relationship, and so it will continue. And so in this season, Pete, it takes that second role, and so I think there was a sense of unawareness on his part of the damage that he was doing to the relationship. And so in my performance, I am often trying to push him more into a state of ego, and more into a state of selfishness, so that he isn't recognizing the damage that he is doing until the very end. At which point, um, he has a moment of clarity where he recognizes that his relationship over the past, however many episodes, has been, it is completely different than he thought it was, and that Tiff has not been treating him the way that that he has believed that she is treating him. And at that point, he makes the decision. He makes a decision with her to essentially, and not to spoil it, but end their friendship at a certain point in the season.
Yeah. It's also interesting how many details we kind of gradually get that build out a lot of his backstory in every single episode. And that was the case in the first season, but it's really building on the foundation of this character that you crafted, whether it's him just making a small mention of, oh, my parents don't leave the house very much. And, that in of itself tells us a lot about his relationship with them, what it was like for him living at home with them. And so when you're kind of combing through the scripts, how much are you looking for those like really small details and just like little bits to build upon the character? And are there moments at any point going into a second season where it's really kind of adjusted and pivoted anything that you'd created in your own mind for his backstory?
Well, I think that there so much of the show is about exploring what people are actually showing to the world, to their coworkers, in their relationships. There's a lot of secrecy in the show. So Pete I imagined that Pete that Pete's parents have no idea what he does. You know, they don't know that he's pursuing comedy. They certainly don't know that he's, you know, working in the BDSM community. And Tiff's family is the same way. They're both, you know, it's that old story of two people living in New York who have moved there and created completely new lives for themselves. And that requires a certain amount of like detachment from expectations from your parents. And I think that gay people are often very good at compartmentalizing those relationships, because you're taught from a young age to be different people, to at least generationally. I experience being many different people to many different groups, based on like my, you know, how comfortable they were with my sexuality, how comfortable I was, how out I was, how in that sort of gray area when I was young anyway. And so I think Pete is living a complete lie from his family, and that sort of detachment, I think, is painful, and also something that he tries not to think about.
Yeah.
And so as he becomes more famous, right, as he potentially gets on stage of the Late Show, you know, he's grappling with not only his relationship with Tiff, but his outing himself in so many different ways in pursuit of a dream.
Yeah. And kind of going a little bit further into character details and working with Ryder on those, you know, you were talking earlier about how much freedom he lets you have in terms of the stand-up comedy and really looks to your experience there. Was there a shift in the collaboration between the two of you with this season, in you having more of an opportunity to kind of bring things to the table with who Pete is as a character and building new dimensions to him?
Well, I definitely felt like Ryder and the writer's room, which was just three of them. Olivia Troy was one of the writers, who was also our BDSM consultant and our intimacy coordinator. So she had three different hats. And then Nana Mensa, who plays Mistress Mira, was another one of our writers. And then Ryder is the writer, creator, and the director of the whole thing. So I felt like they were so in tune with what the story was and my strengths, that I felt like the character really fit me like a glove. And that's how I felt reading the first season too. I was like, oh, hello, somebody wrote me a show. And uh so it felt nice to just sort of slide back into it and try to play against the writing at times in order to complicate my own performance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And kind of going back to his comedy a little bit, there's a moment where there's a conversation about what your limits are on stage and what you're never going to talk about. You know, the manager of the club where he keeps performing never mentions his wife, her wife, and that's kind of her limit. And he hasn't really had that conversation with himself. Is that something that you kind of had a specific conversation with yourself as a stand-up comedian at a certain point about, you know, what you wanted to keep for yourself and not necessarily bring onto stage for an audience?
I definitely, absolutely. I think that it's something when I'm starting out and was starting out and doing shows in basements in Echo Park for 10 people, that there's a fearlessness that you can really say anything on stage. And then as you grow, you realize that certain subjects are places that you're not really exploring for comedy. You're maybe therapizing yourself, or you're just sort of re-traumatizing yourself in pursuit of laughs. And there are certain stories that I have told on stage where, you know, a year or two later, I'll be like, you know, I feel like I did a disservice to the other person in that story, by telling it in that way. You know, and some of that is can be related to family, related to growing up, related to, relationships. And there are times where, I'll have a stand-up bit, I'll have a story, and then, years later have told this story as a bit for so long that I'll be like, was that actually the truth? Or is that something, is this an ebb and flow of a thing I've created? And that can be a bit of a, mind fuck. Sorry. In order,
it's the internet.
right? You can just really like sort of mess yourself up, or do yourself a disservice. Obviously, I miss stand-up so much just talking about it. It's like, oh my God. The last show I did was in New York, February 27th or something like that. The last time I performed live. And there are certain subject matters in your own personal life that as you grow, you have to learn that maybe you shouldn't be talking about them out of respect for yourself or for other people.
And
I think there are definitely comedians who would disagree with that. There are 100% comedians who will disagree with that, but that's my experience. And
yeah, which is, the conversation of the show is so much about each person figuring out their own individual comfort level. And I wanted to kind of ask you, in coming back to the second season of this show and revisiting this character and having the opportunity to kind of dive deeper into him, it's such a gift because you're coming back to him knowing so much about him at this point. But at the same time, I was interested in what still kind of pushes you outside of your comfort zone and challenges you in playing him and working on the series.
Okay, let me think about that for a second. I think a challenge that I have in the show is not overdoing it, right? The second season and the first season are very dramatic. This is a dramedy, so to speak, that has comedic elements. And my wheelhouse, the place I'm most comfortable in my insecurity, is that if people aren't laughing, then I'm not doing a good job. And so there are times where I have to just let Brendan's need for laughter and need for approval go and strip down my performance and do less in order to tell this story correctly. And writer is really good at selecting the takes that he wants in order to tell the story that he wants. So, there are times when there are takes on those dailies where I am in full tears streaming down my face, and they're not in the show because that's not the story that he's telling. So if anything, I have a lot of trust for him and trust that he knows what he's doing. But simplification is something that is difficult for me, and something that I will continue to work on and struggle with throughout my whole career.
Yeah. Well, it's so delightful watching you in the series, and particularly with the places that you take your character in these episodes. And I really hope that you get the opportunity to perform stand-up live for an audience again soon.
Thank you. Me too.
And thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was, I don't always get to do interviews that are so, about the actual work,